This is Tracking the Tropics.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tracking the Tropics, a brand new digital weathercast that puts the most powerful tropics forecast right in the palm of your hand. I'm JB Buno, your stream coordinator today, but the folks that you really want to hear to, they're right here besides me. Storm teammate meteorologist Lee Spann and Julie Phillips of WFLA here in Tampa. How are you guys?
Doing great.
Yeah.
Especially with the tropics being a little quiet right now. We're very excited, and we're really interested, in this new format where we can just kind of talk about the tropics, which is what we do behind the camera all the time.
Right, and this gives us more time to talk about it, especially as we get into the peak of hurricane season. This will be great to talk about everything that we are watching out there.
Tracking the Tropics will be streaming live 1:30 Eastern, 12:30 Central. You'll catch it every week right here on this site or on this app. I want to go right to our featured meteorologist joining us today from WKRG in Mobile, Alabama, Thomas Gieboy, recently named Alabama AP Best Weather Anchor. Thomas, how you doing?
I'm doing well, JB. How about yourself? It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, Thomas and I go back to our days in Mobile, Alabama. Hope all is well, Thomas. We're going to get right here into the forecast, guys, looking at the current conditions here across the United States, right?
Yeah, the best news of all is, as we spread this out from the Gulf to the Caribbean, all the way across over to Africa, no development expected in the next 5 days. It's literally my favorite graphic to put on television and on air.
Yeah, we could use it all the time and we'd be just fine with it. But we have, this isn't too unusual to have it be pretty quiet in June and July. This is really kind of early hurricane season before we get into the peak of the madness.
That's right. So a lot of times June and July do have fewer storms that form, and that gives you some time to prepare and get ready for what is unfortunately the peak of hurricane season. By the time you get into August all the way into the peak, which is September 10th, 61% of all storms form in August and September, and I'm sure Thomas is well aware that that is the time that we settle in for sure.
Oh, for sure. And like we like to say currently, and with the way that the tropics are now, it's nice and quiet. That's just the way that we like it. We always hope that throughout the entirety of the hurricane season, it more or less stays the way that it is currently. But once we really get into July, especially the latter half of July into August and September, then you really got to ramp things up and you got to get ready, because it really doesn't take too long to see a storm flare up, and then soon it could be heading towards land. But hopefully the hurricane season stays nice and quiet. But as always, we always look towards that climatology in September. That's usually the peak. So we still have a little while to go before we even get to that.
And Thomas, we're looking now at the hurricanes predictions for the year. Speaking of what to expect between now and November 30th, where hurricane season does last for a long time, from June 1st to November 30th. And we've put here what the National Weather Service, or NOAA, as well as what the researchers at Colorado State University have forecasted for the next few months.
And that is going to be our NOAA forecast, 9 to 15 named storms. They give a range of storms. Always important to remember, though, that this is just the number of storms that form. It is not how many make landfall. So we can have a very busy season that doesn't necessarily affect us in the U.S., but we're calling for about an average season.
Yeah, the last numbers that you see at the bottom, those are that's what's considered average over time. And so, the hurricanes being 4 to 8, 6 is what the Colorado State researchers are saying, and 6 is the average number each year of hurricanes, which it's a hurricane at 74 mile per hour sustained wind. So once it gets that, 6 of those, around 6, should become hurricanes, and then you get category 3, 4, or 5 storms, and those are fewer, but of course we're very scared of those, especially when they get close to land.
And the major hurricanes, those are going to be the memorable names that you hear about and that you remember, like Michael, like Irma. Those are the storm names you remember.
Yeah, and like you guys mentioned, the seasonal outlooks talk about the entire Atlantic basin as a whole. That includes the Atlantic Ocean, that includes the Caribbean, that includes the Gulf of Mexico. And what those seasonal forecasts, what they can't tell you is whether or not a hurricane is going to hit your home. And so the definitions that they have for the researchers that create these outlooks, their definition of an active season is much different compared to, say, your local meteorologist, who it really doesn't matter what's going on in the season, but if there's one hurricane that's going to be approaching your neighborhood, then it quickly becomes an active season. So no matter what the forecast tells you, and no matter what you see online with those seasonal forecasts, you always have to be ready, because it only takes one of those storms to make it a terrible season for you. And this case in point last year, I'm sure we'll talk about it just a little while ago, just Michael. I mean, you had just that one hurricane. For everyone else, it really wasn't too active of a season. But for the folks in Panama City and Mexico Beach, they probably have a much different perspective.
And the same thing happened with Andrew back in 1992 as well. I mean, it was an A storm. It was literally about the only storm that formed, but it was a Category 5 and hit a major metropolitan area in Miami. So speaking of those names, we've actually already had a subtropical storm, Andrea, which means Barry is up next.
Yes, and we are keeping our eyes peeled. But, June, July, we typically maybe only get to the A or B storm. It's really later on in the season where we start to go through those names. So Barry, then Chantal, then Dorian. So Andrea has already been our first named storm, and we will be hopefully a while before we see our next one.
Let's hope, and that we never see any, of the really strong ones like we did unfortunately see with Michael. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of a glimpse of the power of Hurricane Michael that formed really late in the season. I mean, we're talking about October. A lot of people are already thinking, okay, we're past September and August and September. But it can still, that Gulf of Mexico, the water stays at bathwater temperature for well into October. And it was the first Category 5 hurricane to make landfall in the continental United States since Andrew in 1992.
And it's interesting you said October, because sometimes we kind of let our guards down by October. But October, for any Floridians watching, that can actually be a pretty active year for us. Or, like the Gulf, as you said, is still plenty warm. And there's even that secondary peak in activity in October. So until you get through, really until late October, you don't want to let your guard down yet. That's still part of the active season.
Especially when, 160 mile per hour winds came on shore just before landfall at Mexico Beach. And I know, Thomas, you were saying that you guys were just to the west of that, so you didn't end up getting the strong winds, but you did get some, you did feel the effects because of the wind direction.
Yeah, we did feel the effects because of because as Michael was working its way through the Gulf of Mexico, before we really started to feel the influence of the wind, Michael had a little surge of water that kind of pushed up on our coast. Just the water wasn't too high. But then when Michael was in the process of getting close to making landfall, our entire area, which is more or less destined to the west, to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, we were on the backside of the storm, which meant we got the north winds, which meant our water levels actually went down once we started to see that north wind. And it just goes to show you how close you can be to feeling huge impacts from a Category 5 hurricane to really not feeling that many impacts whatsoever.
And we're just looking at some of this devastation. I mean, obviously, there's only been a few Category 5s that have ever made landfall. I mean, we were looking at them. So it was Andrew was the last one before Michael.
We had the Labor Day hurricane and we had Camille. So it's one of only 4 to make landfall as a Category 5 storm.
And it's just utter destruction where that eye wall comes on shore around the Mexico Beach area. I mean, I happened to be driving rural panhandle of Florida this weekend, and I couldn't believe what the tree situation was. Again, this wasn't actually at landfall, but for miles and miles and miles, I saw trees snapped about a third of the way up. Not the whole root system coming out, but just a whole line of where the trees were snapped, where they had been bent for so much in those strong winds that they all snapped at basically the exact same point on their trunk. And this went 4 miles. And this was just last weekend.
Yeah, I remember doing the... Go ahead. You have a great perspective of this.
It just feels like the worst part about Michael is ashore. Not only did it strengthen rapidly, but it looked like it was still in the process of strengthening when it came inland. So not only was it just on the threshold of becoming a Category 5, and then it eventually was labeled a Category 5, but because it was strengthening when it was coming inland, it really took a long time, and longer than it usually does, for Michael to really lose steam and for hurricanes to lose steam in general. So you saw major hurricane winds last very far inland. And just to your point, you could see tree snap even north of Interstate 10. And I know that they felt those impacts of major hurricane winds in the extreme southeastern portion of Alabama. So not only was it terrible for the coast, but just a lot of trees down throughout a lot of the panhandle right in the direct path of Michael.
And southern Georgia, too. I
was
remember
about
when
to
we
say-
were tracking, I mean, the intensity, it maintained its intensity and did damage all the way up through the panhandle into southern Georgia. Typically, we have these storms come on shore. Sometimes, like he mentioned, they're already weakening. And so as they move on shore, very quickly, those winds start to drop. But this storm really held together and created a large swath of damage.
It really did, and and we talk about a lot about what was happening, but one thing that was very unique, I thought, was that there was that Air Force Base right there, Tyndall Air Force Base, and $6 million in damage just to fighter jets alone. So that's just adding to the total, destruction that happened. Was something that we think saves lives and goes in. And, nothing can get in the way of Mother Nature. I mean, when that storm comes on shore, nothing is safe.
And I remember, I'm going to jump in here, guys.
Yeah.
I remember from the hurricane hunters when we had that aerial imagery that came out, and we saw Tyndall Air Force Base from the skies, and we just saw how devastated that area was. It was really just, it made your heart drop, because I mean, a lot of the pictures that we're seeing here, and a lot of the drones captured the damage, but I mean, when you saw what happened at Tyndall Air Force Base and then the surrounding neighborhoods, because Tyndall's so close to the water right there, it was just absolutely heartbreaking. And Thomas, I know that there are still recovery efforts continuing down there on the Panhandle, right?
Yeah, thankfully that they were just able to get some legislation through to be able to help Tyndall Air Force Base. But just a few years ago, I mean, I was down in Port St. Joe, Mexico Beach. I was covering Hurricane Hermine, based for Nexstar Nation, and I remember just how low everything was and just how pristine everything was over there. And then after seeing what Michael did to that coastline, I mean, I remember driving right along the coast and you couldn't even recognize anything. The only thing that I could really look to were where the inlets came in, but even towards Port St. Joe, I believe it's Cape Sandblast, that was almost kind of ripped in half. It was made two separate islands because of the just the surge and just the winds that Michael brought on. So just the amount of devastation, it's something that you really couldn't fathom. And unless you were actually there on ground zero, which I hope that nobody had to experience, because anytime you see stuff like that, that just changes people's world forever.
You still hear people talk about it from Andrew, just the sound and the smell afterwards. Everything is ingrained in their memory, and that's why we tell people that if your emergency managers tell you to leave, you have to leave. And there's a reason why they tell you to leave. It's because what is there is either going, to completely ruin your house or leave you with just, the scars mentally as well.
Yeah. And it's not just the high winds. We know that with the hurricanes, but storm surge, the biggest threat to property and life during a storm. I know us here in the Tampa Bay area, we're very concerned if there was ever a major storm to hit us because of the massive storm surge. And you can't outrun a 14, 15-foot wall of water. You just can't do it. So always, you run from the water, you hide from the wind, and a Cat 5 just going through that in any structure would be incredibly terrifying.
Terrifying for sure. And I mean, when you look at the devastation, we're showing you the pictures now. I mean, can you even imagine having to watch your house, crumble around you, which is what they had to deal with. So we're hoping that because it's been since 1992 that a Category 5 hurricane made landfall, it brings to mind that if you're told to leave, you should leave, even if you were there covering Hermine, and I'm sure there were people that that said, well, I was here for Hurricane Hermine just a few years ago. I'll be just fine. Yeah. And 3 days earlier, Michael was not even a Category 1 storm, right. 3 days before. So if you're, you can't get settled into a lull of, I've been through hurricanes, because at some point these storms are going to go from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane, and it's going to come on land, and that is exactly, unfortunately, what happened with Michael.
And I'm the only one here that isn't a meteorologist on screen, but maybe I can ask the three of you. When it comes to the monster storm, there's no predicting, right? There's no formula, no scientific math that can point to that monster storm hitting the southeastern United States like we had with Hurricane Michael or various other hurricanes that have struck,
Not
Louisiana, Texas.
No.
Yeah, not specifically. Yeah. I mean, we know that there's going to be more storms versus fewer storms, and we also know where the warmest water is going to be. But you get those few days ahead of time, and that's about it.
And our track forecasting has really improved significantly over the last 20 years. So we have a better idea of where the storms are going. Unfortunately, though, the intensity forecasting, that has not improved as quickly. We're still working on that. And that's why sometimes you can see those forecast intensity at landfall change quite a bit in the course of a short time period. So if you're, watching the storms and watching your local meteorologist giving you the forecast before a storm, know that those forecasts will change each, every few hours from the National Hurricane Center, we update the forecasts.
Thomas?
Yeah, and it's important whenever they issue those track forecasts. Sometimes it goes out the 3-day or the 3+ days that we're able to really get a close eye on, especially if it's coming in from the Atlantic and then moving into the Gulf of Mexico. But sometimes, like in Michael's situation, it rapidly intensifies so quickly that you really don't have the amount of time that most people think that they're going to have. And that happens with weather sometimes. And plus, with the forecast cone, it continues to get better and better. And the National Hurricane Center is doing really good work with making those forecasts better. But what the forecast cone tells you is where the center of the storm can go. It doesn't tell you where the impacts could be. So you could see those skinny, narrow cones, but those impacts are going to be felt well outside of that cone because that forecast track is just for where the center of the system can go. There's a lot of things to keep in mind with hurricanes. It's not just where's the eye going to be, because in most hurricane situations, and you can bring back Katrina being the biggest example of it, impacts can be felt well outside 100 miles east or west of where the center of circulation is.
And that's actually, I've been going back in the recent years to tell people, because these hurricanes forecasts can change, be careful with social media. Even if it's not someone trying to be, outlandish with their forecast, even if you are sharing from your, respected sources like our meteorologist, like the National Hurricane Center, but you're sharing it from yesterday or the day before, then that forecast can be wrong and you're spreading wrong information. So I beg you that when you see something on social media, even if it comes from your trusted sources, look at the timestamp. Look and see when that forecast was issued, because things can change and you may be more in the path or you may be less in the path, but you just have to go and get the most recent information, because sometimes it can change so rapidly.
It can, and sometimes we'll see things that are shared, weeks later or months later, but it doesn't take, even just a couple of days later in hurricane forecasting, even a day later, things can change significantly. So always follow your trusted sources too on social media. That is important. Your local meteorologist that you trust, your emergency management, your city, because those are going to help keep you informed during those times. And hopefully it stays quiet, but now's the time to prepare, get prepared for hurricane season. Before anything is brewing up.
And stay informed with Tracking the Tropics, right? Our brand new digital live stream here that we're going to be bringing you every Wednesday at 1:30 Eastern, 12:30 Central. We'll be visiting meteorologists from across the country. Actually, they'll be visiting us. They're going to be coming in and or calling in to talk with us about the current tropics conditions. And before we end out here, guys, the tropics really quiet right now, right?
Very quiet.
Just the way we like it.
Just the way that
If I could give
like
that
it.
forecast for 6 more months, it would make me a very happy meteorologist.
I think it would make a whole lot of people really happy. So, Thomas, thanks so much for joining us from Mobile, Alabama. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you guys for having me.
All right, everybody, for JB Buno, Lee Spann, Thomas Keyboy, Julie Phillips, we're all here in our fun little boxes here on screen here on Tracking the Tropics. It's a lot of fun to be able to bring this to you. Be sure to, again, catch it every Wednesday, 1:30 Eastern, 12:30 Central on this site or on this app. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for watching Tracking the Tropics.